So my name's Rob MacDonald. I work as a psychologist in our community here, and myself and a few volunteers here at our church have gotten together to produce a couple of resources for managing mental health aspects of going through a pandemic. We've been developing a couple of short videos on how to cultivate healthy emotional, mental, behavioral practices in the midst of an extremely challenging season. Now, as this crisis has evolved, as people, we've had to adapt to significant collective changes that have happened with astonishing speed. And with these changes comes significant loss, and there's a very real sense of grief and anger that accompanies loss, especially when not all of those losses are even realized yet. So I want to start today with grief. Now, grief is a natural response to a loss. And we have faced losses on multiple levels and multiple fronts lately, some of which will only become clearer the longer this goes on. Now, initially there was losses such as kids facing loss of being around their friends or in their schools, and the initial canceling of everything, not being able to go out anymore, not being able to go to church, not being able to stop in on friends and neighbors, not being able to go to grandma's house, not being able to go to your favorite park, all the no longer able tos that we're gradually have been becoming aware of as this has gone on. Those are all a series of losses. There's been bigger losses too, like the loss of a sense of security, a loss of a sense of predictability, of direction, maybe even the ability to provide for your family. The loss of a role, like provider or the strong one or a helper or any of those kinds of things. All these losses that we have been facing, they need to be grieved. Now, the problem is we're generally very poor at grieving well, and we tend towards minimization, we tend towards pretending things don't affect us. But being able to list and itemize these losses is a great first step to dealing with grief. Now, once the initial crisis fades, pretty much with any crisis, but especially this one I've noticed, many of us have found that we've got time and energy to figure out who's to blame for all of this calamity and to start to reach out in anger and indignation. So we start to criticize and we start to say, if only Trump or if only Trudeau, if only the Chinese had done X, Y, Z, we wouldn't be here. And if our leaders were more competent, things would be different. And once we realize that this is fruitless, we turn to things around us. So we start getting angry at things like disposable gloves left on the ground at the parking lots, at the people smoking in line at the grocery store, at someone going the wrong way in the one-way aisles. Some of us are even getting mad at store clerks for all the different rules and setups that they have there to keep everybody safe. So we have this pent-up energy that seems to have a need to go somewhere. And it often finds release, on a normal day in political discourse. But closer to home, we experience anger at maybe the choices your employers made. We experience irritability with the kids or the pets or whoever. And when the initial scrambling and adapting to a crisis fades, anger tends to come to the surface and look for an outlet. Now, we need to be aware of this and instead find healthy ways to funnel that energy into doing things and engaging in positive action that keeps us helping others, not attacking them. Now, dealing with grief and anger, though, demands a certain amount of intentionality around what we allow ourselves to think about, how we acknowledge and accept our own feelings, what kind of behaviors that either are life-giving or life-draining for us, and what kinds of things we can do with our physical selves to cope better, and what can be done spiritually as well, all to induce growth and flourishing instead of distress and anguish. Now, I want to take a minute and kind of talk to what is kind of the unnamed emotion. I've been using grief and anger to label what many of us are feeling, but I want to acknowledge that there does seem to be for many of us, a collective kind of confusion, an unnamed vague emotion underlying our dis-ease, and many of us are having a hard time getting a handle on what that is. And some have even started to call this unnamed sense soul ache. Now, being isolated, unfortunately, brings out soul ache even more. And we can't do anything with it other than sit with it. Now, usually as therapists, we encourage clients to label their experience, to speak their feelings and thoughts. And once they're out in the open, we can do something with them or do nothing with them and just let them be. But this feeling that's happening, it's difficult to do that with. And that adds another layer of stress in not knowing what it is and not being able to give it a real good name. So I think some of us are suffering in a bit of a haze or a heaviness that collectively is hard on us and it's hard to identify, but a lot of people feel it. Now, the closest feeling we can come to describe this soul ache is grief. And at the center of grief is a loss, which usually involves some anger as well. That's pretty natural. Or some sadness, but I'm going to focus on anger. And now when it comes to anger, we tend to feel it when we perceive a wrong has been committed against us. So if you get cut off in traffic, the anger you feel is towards the wrong. Getting cut off can be dangerous, so the transgression is that it put you in danger, and you will naturally feel anger as a result of that. It's the same as if someone buys the last 2 bags of flour. Not only is it against the rules, but it does harm in depriving you and the next person of it. We feel anger when something is taken from us as well, such as our freedom to move around or to visit whoever we want. And anger can be healthy once the offense is identified as potential, and then potentially you can work it through with another person in a civil way if the offense and feelings are primary and you're not just engaged in attacking in terms of retribution. Now, well-channeled anger can lead to positive action, like looking out for injustices and working to rectify them. Anger is common, though, in the midst of loss, as we naturally seek out who's to blame. But instead of using that energy to lash out at others or at maybe Asian people, for example, I've noticed that lately, that energy could be positively channeled into community action, thinking of ways to help others, sending encouraging messages, writing songs or poems or making videos to post and so on. Now, when it comes to grief and anger, how do we manage this? Now, the author Scott Brinto of the Harvard Business Review put it perfectly when he titled his article, "That Discomfort You're Feeling is Grief." And this came out a few weeks ago, and I'm sure, or perhaps you noticed it, but he interviews a man named David Kessler from grief.com for the article, and I want to borrow a couple of his ideas here. Now, first, you might be familiar with Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief, which, of course, aren't linear, don't have to happen in order, but they help organize our emotional experiences with grief. So the first one is denial, which happened early on, as such like, this virus won't affect me, or it won't be that bad, or it's just a little flu. And then there was anger. We had anger at governments for their various actions or non-actions or making us stay home. Then the third stage, bargaining, which happens when we agree to isolate for 2 weeks and then everything will be all better. Or we bargain, and this I've seen in some areas, where what's the problem with still holding a church service, for example, if everyone there wears a mask? That would be bargaining. Sadness is the fourth one, which happens when we're wondering if this will all end and when. And then acceptance, which is figuring out how to go forward now that this is all really happening. Now, Kessler emphasizes that acceptance is where the power lies, because there's control in acceptance, realizing that we can do simple things like wash your hands and keep your distance that relate to and learn to relate to customers differently, or learn how to work from home. Acceptance allows us to do that because it gives us control over some of those behaviors. Second, we need to find balance in our thinking. Anxiety and worry tend to generate worst case scenarios. They give us mental pictures of the worst things that can happen. They give us what if scenarios. And our imaginations are powerful, and they show us images in our minds like this of all the awful things that can happen. And our goal is not to ignore those things or try and make them go away, because your mind won't let you do that anyway. The goal is to find balance in the things that you're thinking. So Kessler says, if you feel the worst image in your mind is taking shape, make yourself or allow yourself or challenge yourself to think of the best image or a different image. So in other words, we all get sick at times and the world continues. Or not everyone I love dies. Or maybe we minimize deaths because we're taking the right steps. So that's a bit of an example of engaging a worst case scenario and coming up with an alternate scenario that's different or opposite. Third, we need to speak our feeling. This is especially important with grief. When facing loss, it's important to identify and express the associated feelings, whether that's guilt, anger, fear, helplessness, or sadness. And when we acknowledge that feeling and when we express it to others, there's power in it, such as being honest that you've had a hard day, or were crying for no apparent reason, or irritable with your household. When you name it, you feel it, and it moves through you. So Kessler has this great line here: emotion needs motion. And that's what emotion is all. That's what we're trying to do with our emotional selves, is let it process out in some way, shape, or form. And lastly, we need to find meaning. It's important for us to find meaning in our loss and grief, because without it, life is meaningless and pointless. So the fact that we can keep our social networks going on in different ways than before is an example, where we use technology now to connect with family members and not feel so disconnected. Now, people are appreciating now the simple things in life, like being able to go for a walk. And if you've been in a situation where you've been mandated to self-isolate in your home, you know how precious it is to leave your property now. And these types of things we learn to appreciate, and we learn to be grateful for. And we're also finding things like, potentially, if you're in a situation where your pace of family life has slowed, and you've noticed time together is different and is more engaging. Maybe you've noticed that boredom can result in creativity, which is really important, because creativity tends not to happen in the context of being rushed and in sort of being distracted all the time. Now, whenever we face grief from a loss, it's helpful to create tangible expressions of that loss. So there are a couple of ideas for that. Creating tangible expressions like a photo or a writing or some form of artwork or a drawing or a role play or even a skit as a form of meaning making. For example, it's healing if children make drawings, for example, of how much they miss their friends, or maybe if they perform a skit about a virus that scares them but then they overcome it. That kind of thing is healing. For adults, journaling, spending time with your thoughts and feelings and creating something tangible can be very healing. And one way to help identify and express feeling and acknowledge hurt while at the same time finding meaning in the things that we perhaps overlook is to use an ancient little tool called the Awareness Examine. It asks 2 questions of yourself at various times throughout the day, potentially, but maybe especially in your kind of sleep routine. And the 2 questions go like this. 1, for what am I least grateful for today? For what am I least grateful? And then the second one, for what am I most grateful for today? Now, you've maybe have heard that gratefulness and finding thanks and being thankful for things is crucial to sort of mental health and wellness, and it's true. And a lot of times, what we do is we say, potentially, find 3 things you can be thankful for over the course of this day, which is really helpful. What is different about this is it acknowledges that there's a least thankful as well. because finding gratitude is known to be essential for processing grief and loss. And so what this does is it acknowledges hurt from the losses, but also finds essentials to be thankful for. And when you're honest about something negative to happen today, you create a context to acknowledge, identify, and express that feeling, while at the same time, perhaps realizing that you're thankful for something you learned about yourself anyway, and that now you appreciate more. And finding things to be thankful for, one thing I'm most thankful for, makes us focus on what's important and vital to us, which in times of trouble are usually those things we forget about or overlook when life is focused on other things that we don't really need. So I want to share that with you. For what am I least grateful for today? And for what am I most grateful for? All right, thank you for listening. I hope you can join us for our next video as well on depression.